This episode is actually supposed to be the story about how I ran for first year class president in my first year of college, and I did not get to that. This was supposed to be a short 2-minute introduction about where I see the podcast going, and it just turned into this whole couple minute thing. Welcome to the Conversasean podcast. I'm your host, Sean Fermantes. It's been a while since I've done one of these episodes. In fact, the last episode that I did was with my friend Louis Demulis, and we actually recorded that during the summer of last year, 2023. As I'm recording this episode today, it is May 2024. Literally 6 days ago, I graduated from college. That's right, I am now a professional graphic designer, Bachelor of Arts degree holder Sean Fermantes. So it's been a while. Over the course of the past year, I've grown a lot. I've thought through a lot of things. I've grown through a lot of things, and a lot has changed. My content and my design and everything else around me has also grown. This podcast is now going through a growing phase. It's been a long time since I've really taken a step back and gotten to think about stuff. Now that I've graduated and now that I'm in my master's degree, I have a bit more time on my hands. And with that time, I thought, why not do something good? Something that I want to do, and do the podcast. I've been learning a lot in my classes about content creation. And I've been watching a lot more stuff about content creation, watching YouTube videos, reading books all about, leadership, starting businesses, making good content. I work in the content space. I have 2 social media internships and I still work for my college. I create graphics, I edit videos, but I wanted to do something that I made and that I created. And so this podcast is it. When I started this podcast, I knocked on Nike's door because we were still sweet mates at the time. And I said, hey, do you want to do the podcast now? I had mentioned, wanting to do the podcast, but that was the first step forward, was recording an actual episode. And so we recorded that episode in the room. When I started the podcast, I really had no plan. I'll admit that. I was kind of starting the podcast just to start the podcast. And there's nothing bad about just starting something. Gary Vaynerchuk says this a lot, but a lot of people just don't start. But I didn't really have a plan for the podcast. And so, I would get guests on. And the guest episodes, I love the guest episodes, by the way. I listen to them. Interviewing people and talking to people and getting to know people. And then also getting to record it and getting to broadcast it, on Spotify and YouTube. It's just amazing. But in the end of the day, I didn't really have a plan for stuff other than, let me interview people and learn more about podcasting and whatnot. When Lewis's episode came out, I think a couple days later, he came up to me and was like, yeah, Sean, people at my internship are watching your podcast. They watched the podcast and they loved it. And that's when a light bulb went off my head and I was like, oh my gosh. People, professionals, other people other than myself and my friends are actually listening and watching this podcast. I think this is really like a content creation thing, or maybe this is just a thing in general where people start something, they start a business and they think, oh, one day we'll be big and people will actually be paying attention to what we're doing. But what they don't realize is no matter how small you are or no matter how big you are, especially with podcasting and content creation and all of that, regardless of whether you have 5 people following your page or 1,000 or 100,000 or 1 million people following your page, people are watching. I think for a while I was in the headspace of, oh, well, I'm starting this podcast and, it's fun. I have a podcast and a couple friends are listening to it and my family's listening to it and people here and there are listening to it. But there's an actual audience that is watching this podcast. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this isn't just a fun thing anymore. Don't get me wrong, it's still fun. I love to do this, which is why I'm doing this episode right now. This podcast is a really fun thing for me. That's why I'm doing it. But it's not just a fun thing anymore. People are actually listening. In the back of my head, I always wanted the podcast to grow. I guess in a way, I was thinking, oh, well, maybe once there's 100 listeners or 200 listeners, then maybe I'll reevaluate and see what to do in the podcast. But it was in that moment where I was like, okay, there's an actual audience for this podcast here. I want to ensure that this podcast is well thought out, that it's valuable to you, because it would be a waste of time if I didn't plan episodes or put an episode out just to put an episode out. There's an actual audience for this podcast, and it's you. And you're listening to this podcast. And I'm so thankful for that. It's a different thing when you're thinking and dreaming one day, people listening to the podcast versus oh my gosh, people are actually listening to the podcast. And so I want to make sure this podcast is valuable to you. So if you've been listening since the beginning, if you've been supporting through the beginning, or you're just supporting now, thank you. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for supporting content creation. I've been trying to think of ways to make this podcast better, because I want this podcast to not only be, valuable, but I also want it to be authentic, and I also want it to be worthwhile to listen to. Not that the guest episodes are not worthwhile to listen to. Don't get me wrong. Those are extremely valuable. I want to try something different. I want this podcast to be more engaging. And I also want to show, the more authentic side of myself. I would like to take some opportunities to not only, share my stories, because that's what communication is, right? At the end of the day, communication is storytelling. But I also want to share other people's stories. So you're going to hear stories from me. You're going to hear stories from other people. Don't worry about the guest episode. Guests are still going to be on this podcast. In fact, if you're still interested in being a guest on this podcast, DM me, Conversation Podcast. So we're still going to do guest episodes. This episode is actually supposed to be the story about how I ran for first year class president in my first year of college. And I did not get to that. This was supposed to be a short 2-minute introduction about where I see the podcast going. And it just turned into this whole couple-minute thing. And I guess this will be the first podcast. I guess the first podcast should be reintroducing the podcast, because that's what I'm doing right now. And so this is the Conversation Podcast. I hope you come along this journey, because it's going to be really fun. I promise that I will do my best with this podcast. So, and I hope you tune into it.